We are not just holding back the onslaught, but also reclaiming our territories. It became known, based on the results of a close meeting with Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, that the armed forces of Ukraine managed to stabilize the situation in the Sumy direction and even push the enemy back. In particular, it became known that in the Sumy region, the occupiers have concentrated around 53,000 troops, who have been relentlessly assaulting our defensive line for several days. However, despite such efforts, our fighters managed to recapture the settlement of Andriyivka from the enemy and carry out successful counter-operations.
We spent whole days for pizza.
As a result of these days, special gratitude is owed to the soldiers of the 225 separate assault regiment. This is specifically for their offensive actions in the border areas of the Sumy region and the liberation of Andriyivka in particular. Thank you very much, guys. I would also like to mention today the 425th Separate Assault Regiment for their successful actions in our Pokrovsk direction.
Overall, analysts assess the Russian offensive in the Sumy direction as a continuation of the Kursk operation. By concentrating tens of thousands of soldiers there, the Kremlin sent hundreds of fighters to their deaths every day, which eventually produced results. As a result, the tactic was deemed successful, and now these meat-grinder assaults are continuing in order to advance deeper into Ukraine.
At that time, the Russians managed to eventually find our weak spot, which was logistics. This Sumy-Sudzha highway was the only thread that connected our contingent with the main forces. To cut it off and under the threat of encirclement, forced us to retreat closer to the border. Now, the Russians are mechanically repeating the same tactic, trying quite successfully. UTO cut off our forces in the Sumy region from the main forces by severing the Sumy-Sudzha highway, but this time it's already on our territory.
However, the occupiers are only able to reach Sumy in propaganda talk shows. In reality, the occupation of the regional center is completely out of the question, according to the military. The Russians simply do not have enough reserves concentrated there for that, but the real objective is to inflict maximum terror on the local population of the city.
The goal was to get as close to Sumy as possible in order to subject the city to attacks by FPV drones and artillery, tube artillery. At that time, indeed, some Russian figures claimed that they had already gained the ability, as of about the middle of last week, to strike Sumy with FPV drones. They were very pleased about this. But now we see that, according to the president and the available sources, the plan was to push the enemy back.
Just as, in fact, the situation was improved in another hot spot in the direction of Pokrovsk. Our troops are indeed recording minor successes by Russian forces there. However, the results claimed by propagandists are still a long way off.
In the main directions of attack, the pressure continues and the fighting remains very fierce and intense, both in the Pokrovsk direction and between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, as well as south of Pokrovsk in the Novopavlivka direction. The situation there is very difficult. And also in the Lyman area, for the most part, where they have achieved some successes. But to say that they can now break through the defenses there and reach operational depth, no, that's not the case. Our forces are countering them and they lack the necessary resources.
The Dnipropetrovsk direction also remains on the agenda. According to the president, the Russians are spreading disinformation here, trying at least to set foot on the administrative border by sending in small sabotage and reconnaissance groups. These groups keep publishing photos claiming that Russia has already reached this area. At the same time, they conveniently forget to mention that when the saboteurs return to their units after another information psychological operation, they are regularly eliminated by the armed forces of Ukraine.
The enemy continues to press along the entire front line.
There has been a sharp intensification of combat clashes along the entire length of the front. That's about 1,200 kilometers. Moreover, it should be noted that over the past 2 weeks, the intensity of combat clashes has increased by a third.
The situation in northeastern Ukraine is rapidly escalating. After the Russian invaders made a series of breakthroughs in early June, at least 5 villages came under enemy control, according to the General Staff.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Among them are Velika Pisarivka, Rishivka and several other small border settlements.
It is worth recalling that as early as last year, the enemy began amassing forces, both personnel and equipment, which were primarily used against the defense forces of Ukraine, who were and continue to conduct their operations within the Kursk region. And it is precisely from these forces that the enemy is deploying infantry groups in an attempt to enter our territory. But if we compare the length of the border with Russia within the Sumy region, it is more than 550 kilometers, and the areas where the enemy is using small-scale assault tactics are actually quite limited.
According to the latest data from deep states, the enemy is present in the villages of Andriyivka and Yevdolyaki.
The Russians are conducting tactical operations to establish a new northern front line, just as we are doing in both directions. In other words, the Russians are trying to cut off our territorial salient into Russian territory. We, in turn, are trying to cut off a similar salient into our territory, literally just a dozen kilometers to the west near Tetkino. So in other words, both sides are simultaneously establishing a line of contact. The problem is that this line is forming not far from our capital. But the same trouble is happening in Kharkiv and Kherson, that is with our regional centers. And Zaporizhia is also not far off. So we have issues with our regional centers. They are either close to the Russian border or to the line of contact, the front line. Basically from, well, you could say from Sumy to Kherson.
The main goal of Putin's people is to create a buffer zone.
The main objectives of the occupiers are to gain direct control over the settlements of Andriyivka and Khotin specifically. Control over these settlements will allow the Russian occupation forces to keep the residential districts of the regional center under fire control, including with the use of tube and rocket artillery.
Yes, the enemy is rapidly approaching the regional center. The Russians are now only 22 kilometers away from the city of Sumy. That's less than half an hour's drive for military vehicles. But there's no need to despair ahead of time. After all, Ukrainian defenders are putting up serious resistance. And the Russians don't have operational reserves to capture the regional center. But against this backdrop, the aggressor may resort to its favorite tactic, terrorizing the civilian population.
In my opinion, the occupiers will switch to a tactic of terror against the civilian population. That is, indiscriminate strikes on residential neighborhoods with the aim of sowing chaos, panic among the civilian population, and distrust toward the actions of central and local authorities. And most importantly, to provoke mass migration deeper into Ukrainian territory.
It also cannot be ruled out that the Russian advance in the Sumy region may be part of a broader plan. For example, just as the Ukrainian armed forces entered the Kursk region to disrupt the Russian offensive in Donbass, now they may be putting pressure on Sumy to force Ukraine to redeploy reserves from the south. This would open up an opportunity for the occupiers to advance in the Zaporizhia region. And all these bloodthirsty actions of Putin's horde are happening in parallel with enormous losses. After all, the Russian war machine spares no one.
The tactics of the Russian occupiers involve small infantry groups operating without support from heavy armored vehicles. This tactic is a result of the successful actions of Ukrainian drones. Up to 70% losses in personnel and heavy armored vehicles.
Some are killed, and then other groups move in, and this basically happens every day. Their objective is to amass forces on Ukrainian territory and essentially to expand the area of fighting within our country. But, as we can see, the enemy is unable to achieve any significant advance.
Despite the fact that the situation is tense along the entire front line, the Ukrainian armed forces control every section of it and are doing everything possible to stop and destroy the enemy.